myself again.
Good morning, welcome to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith. I'm joined by Mick Lowe's this morning. Morning, Mick.
Hiya, Steve, how are you?
Yeah, bit of a thick head, it has to be said after last night.
Good lad.
Friday night games, I do enjoy them. Like we I think that's the first in the Premiership. My dad was saying. I think we had about 5 in the Championship. But a good night had by all, and we didn't get beat, Mick, which is a bonus, which we'll get on to talking about now. What did you make of the game?
Well, as you say, it was a bonus that they didn't get beat, because I have to say that up until about the 20th minute, they looked like doing nothing else other than getting beat. They were a goal behind, softish goal, but you've seen them scored. But they were getting absolutely mullered. I think first 15 minutes, Leeds had something like 75% possession, and they were just picking us off. And this whole back five that we've talked about before, the 3 centre backs and the 2 wing backs who aren't natural defenders, just wasn't working. And Leeds at will were literally cutting through us. I mean, they were just playing balls out from the back four into the feet of people like Calvin Phillips, and away they went, playing it wide to either James or to Rafinha. And they were causing all sorts of problems. And all of a sudden, you see Graham Jones come down from the stand where he's got the overview. He's clearly seen the problem, if they didn't know it before the game already, the way that Leeds played. So he comes down and they drag Matt Ritchie, who I thought was absolutely fantastic in terms of the way that he, again, drove the team on. His attitude absolutely personifies everything you want from a player who, is trying desperately to turn the ship round as it is at the moment. But he was called across. He was clearly told, it's not working as a left wing back. We need to go to a flat 4. They needed desperately to throw Hayden back into midfield where he's more comfortable, to give Longstaff and Joe Willock a bit of a helping hand in there. And suddenly it changed, and suddenly we were combative in midfield. We were making a fist of it. We were a little bit more regimentated defensively, because prior to that, we just, as we did on many, we do on many occasions, we just looked like 5 fellas just thrown together and trying to see what happens and see what comes. And they look much better. And then they get the goal, courtesy of, without a shadow of a doubt, the man of the match, Saint-Maximin. And, the second half wasn't as great. But, in the end, a draw was probably a fair result. The thing that made me laugh, Steve, was that on TV, I mean, they're absolutely raving about this game. They're talking about it as if it was up there with some of the greatest games in Premier League history. I mean, the second half, like I say, it quietened down a bit. But the first half was like a school playground. It was like jumpers down. You have a go, we have a go. It was like Keystone Cops. It was like a silent, it was like an old silent movie. You expected Buster Keaton to come on as a substitute. I mean, it was chaos, absolute chaos. And then they're raving about it. And I'm thinking, Carragher must have played in the 4-3. Neville must have played in the 5-0. And I'm thinking, if you ever saw a decent game, how would you react then? Because it was mildly entertaining. But at the same time, it was pure anarchy. It was anarchy, that first half. It was never mind Buster Keaton. You could have had, Johnny Rotten and bloody Vivian Westwood come on at one point. It was crazy. But you take the draw, and I suppose it's a measure of where we are at the moment. That Leeds at home and at below strength, and much below strength Leeds. You take a point, and to be fair, they were settling for the point towards the end rather than we were, I think. And if we could have just pulled one more rabbit out of the hat with Saint-Maximin, who knows? They may have won it, but at the same time, to be fair, Leeds had a point when they said they were a bit disappointed they didn't score more than 1.
The big change, of course, was Darlow coming in for Woodman. I don't even think made the bench last night. Gillespie was on the bench. I've got to be honest, I did turn to my dad last night and say, I felt if Woodman had been in goal last night, we probably would have lost that. There was one chance in particular where the ball fell at the feet of, was going to fall at the feet of Bamford, and Darlow just collected at his feet. And I don't know, there just seemed to be a bit of a newfound confidence, reliable hands in goal, make a big difference to a back four, Mick.
I think that might be a little bit harsh, but I take on board everything you're saying, and you're absolutely right. The relationship between a goalkeeper and a back four is key. regardless of how good you think the keeper is. A lot of it is mental, as you say. You know, you get the impression that Jamal Lascelles and Kieran Clark and the likes were looking at Darlow and thinking, okay, I'm a little bit happier with that. Because Freddie Woodman is so new to the thing, I think that was the problem. I think they were unsure. You know, defenders aren't sure whether keepers are going to come for corners. They're not sure whether keepers are going to be vocal. They're not sure, you know, what keepers do in certain situations. They know exactly what Carl Darlow's all about. They've played in front of Carl Darlow often enough. I think as a keeper, I don't think he's hugely better than Freddie Woodman. And I think you could put a slight question mark against the goal, maybe a very slight one, maybe more against the defenders. But you see that goal quite a lot in football these days. Balls that are whipped in, and they're whipped in with such pace and such bend. Actually, if no one gets a touch on it, the goalkeeper who's expecting a defender or a striker to get a touch is suddenly caught unawares, and he was. But I think his overall play, and as you say, I think maybe his composure, I think that's the word we're looking for, isn't it? His composure and his maturity in goal made the difference. What I'd like to know is, and I was listening to all the build-up, and there seemed to be a question mark over why Woodman wasn't on the bench. I think it transpired there was talk of an illness, and I would hope that there was an illness, because I just thought when I saw the teams and I saw the subs and I saw Gillespie was on the bench, I'm thinking, hang on a minute. You've had a goalkeeper who's been out with COVID. You've had a goalkeeper who's been out for a long time, and you put him in and you put a kid on the bench who, if you had to bring him in to a Friday night Premier League game, I mean, it would be literally like jumping in at the deep end. So I'm hoping there were mitigating circumstances for why Woodman wasn't on the bench, because if he wasn't on the bench because they kept speculating, maybe his head's not in the right place, maybe he's this, maybe he's that. I mean, I think that's a bit of a condemnation of the team selection, because even if his head's not right, you've got to have him on the bench instead of somebody like Gillespie, who was a million miles away from a Premier League game on a Friday night at St James's. So maybe that'll come out in the wash. As I say, there were one or two whispers and one or two thoughts flying around that Woodman was injured and as a result wasn't involved in the squad at all. So I would hope that's the case. But no, yeah, I think Darlow made a difference. He is more of a presence. And especially when you consider the problems that they've got defensively, you need the best option you've got behind a back four that is already as leaky as a sieve. So, you know, let's see what he does next game.
Yeah, Ginger Hoskins says, Mick, is Bruce deluded? Everybody's screaming for him to leave, but in his head, he thinks he's good enough. I saw Jones countering everything Bruce was shouting. It did look a lot like that, to be fair, in the ground. When you watch the sidelines, it can be a tad embarrassing for Steve Bruce. And I've got to be honest, at the end of the game, and I did double check this on the footage when I got back in from my night out last night. You know, Bruce shook Bielsa's hand, and then he's straight off down the tunnel. And I don't know whether this is deliberate, but Jones waits. He's patting all the players. He's shaking hands. He's, you know, he's saying, "Look, I've managed at a low level myself. I know what it's like. You do like to shake people's hands." But Bruce was straight down the tunnel after seeing Bielsa. Graham Jones seems to be there, and just seems to be more of a hands-on man manager type of person. You know.
I think you can read that one of two ways. I mean, you know, I've come on here before, and you know, I am a great believer in body language, but sometimes you can read it wrong. Obviously, you can read it wrong. You know, we don't know the individuals that well, and I have to say, when Jones came down from his overview to make the change, and they did make the change to go to a flat four, which, as I keep saying, for me was the defining moment of the game. It was a tad embarrassing that all the discussions and all the heated conversations and all the pointing of the fingers and all the cajoling and all the haranguing of players and telling them this and telling them that and moving people around, all of that was being done by a very, very animated and very vocal Graham Jones. And almost in the background as a shadow-like character was Steve Bruce. But as somebody made the point to me last night, well, that's what he's paid for. He's the coach, you know? He is the guy who coaches the side. He is the guy who's up in the stand for one reason and one reason only, to take an overview. And he saw something that clearly Steve Bruce didn't, and he came down and he made the point, and it changed the game. I agree with what you say, and I've made the point in many other, conversations we've had about the body language between Bruce and Jones not looking good. But going back to the point you made at the end, and I'm sure it's 100% correct, maybe, Steve, that they've got to a situation where, as happens at a lot of clubs, I mean, Manchester United, where Steve Bruce was for so long, is an ideal case in point. I'm not in that for a slightest. I don't want people start falling off the chairs laughing here. I'm not comparing Steve Bruce with Sir Alex Ferguson. But there's a case in point. You've got a statesman-like manager who, as soon as the final whistle blows, he's off. He shakes hands with his opposite number, but he's off. Who's left on the field? Your coach, your Brian Kidd, your Mike Phelan back in the day at Manchester United. It still happens an awful lot nowadays. Managers want to get back down into the dressing room. They are, whether we like it or not. If you go to a football club, Steve, there aren't that many managers as such out on the training pitch anymore. They've got a million things to do. Sir Alex Ferguson used to sit in his office on, looking out over the cliff, and all the coaches would be doing all the training, and he'd be dealing with X, Y, and Z. Steve Bruce probably most of the time does the same and leaves it to Stephen Clements, to Graham Jones, Steve Agnew, etc. So, it isn't the worst thing in the world that there isn't a particularly fantastic relationship between the first team coach and the manager, and that on occasions the manager doesn't look like he's participating in what the coach is doing, because they do a lot of the time, Steve, at football clubs have completely different roles these days. So and going back to the first point about the grief and the animosity. Again, watching it, I just got the feeling that, a bit like many other occasions, again, it's the minority who are making all the noise. It's the minority who are stirring it up. But actually, watching the game, you were at the stadium. I wasn't at the stadium. I got the sense that 90%, 80% of the fans were with Newcastle all the way through. That they didn't really turn. It was only in that final 2 or 3 minutes when there were one or two Brucey out, shouts and screams and balls and whatever. But I think for the majority of the game, the fans stuck with them. Yes, and it started badly and it could have got worse. So I think all in all, the expected demonstrations from the stands, protests from the stands, never really materialized. And invariably they don't, Steve. I've been in that ground hundreds of times when people have said, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and it just never happens.
Yeah, I would agree. I've tagged you in something on Twitter, actually, which is just a little clip of Graham Jones getting one of his points across during the game last night to Matt Ritchie. People making a big thing about Bruce conceding and just letting Jones do it, but if it's for the better of the team, let him crack on. He is getting paid. He is getting paid to do that. Paul reckons
the thing that I bet you it's the same clip I watched again last night, and I agree with everything you said, and I've actually contradicted what I'm about to say by saying everything I've just said about the relationship between managers and coaches. But somebody else texted me, somebody quite eminent in the game texted me and said that looked for all the world like a dress rehearsal for wanting the main job, because at one point it was pretty much clear who was making the decisions and who was who was changing the system without really any input at all from Steve Bruce. But it worked. It saved the game. It got them defensively better. So if it works, who cares who does it?
Paul says Matt Ritchie's getting murdered every game. Nobody seems to see this. Look, Matt Ritchie was unlucky last night. He could have had a goal. He runs his heart into the ground. Absolutely. His legs, unfortunately, aren't as good as they were when we first signed him. But you know what I mean. He does his best in the position that he selected for me.
Do you know what it is? If you think Matt Ritchie is the problem, we have got serious times ahead. Because Matt Ritchie, and I'm sure Matt Ritchie will be the first to admit, he is not a left fullback, and certainly not at this stage of his career. Matt Ritchie's getting on. Matt Ritchie hasn't got the pace that these young bucks have as either wing backs or fullbacks who go racing, tearing past you. For starters, the lad's coming to the end of his career. He's been a fantastic pro, and he still is. That's what he is now. He's a fantastic pro. And yes, he might get found wanting defensively, but he is literally the closest thing we've got to the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike. And he's just standing there and he's trying to stop the water come through. And he's trying to stop Rafina one week. He's trying to stop somebody else the next week. And I tell you what, he doesn't always do a good job and he'll hold his hands up, I'm sure. But what he brings to the team in terms of cajoling people into how many times does, again, talking about his lack of pace at this stage of his career, even if he had great pace, I don't think he ever had great pace. The number of times he's on the overlap, putting crosses in. He must have put half a dozen crosses in that first half yesterday. You know, the number of blocks he makes, the number of challenges he makes. He's always in and around the game. He's always having a word with somebody. Yes, he's a feisty little character. Yes, he's prickly, but he's an absolute nightmare to play with on occasions. But I tell you what, he is an absolute godsend for Newcastle at the moment because we don't have enough talkers and we don't have enough leaders, Steve. That is absolutely as clear as the nose on your face. We don't have enough big characters in that team. And he might not be big in stature, Matt Ritchie, but he's an absolute monster in terms of what he brings to that team, in terms of, getting the rest of them going, driving people on, telling people what they need to be told. No, Matt Ritchie is far, far, far from the problem.
Yeah, Yano says, please don't think I'm just hating on Lascelles, but surely you guys agree he must be dropped. Lascelles fan Mick, do you think he deserves rest? I mean, we've got Fernandez, we've got Shaw.
Yeah. Said it all along, Steve. I mean, he sort of got the captaincy by convenience, really. He was, again, going back to the point I've just made about the lack of leaders and the lack of shouters and the lack of ballers and the lack of leaders, for want of a better phrase. He sort of got it by convenience. I think what he needs to do first and foremost is look after himself as a defender. Again, he was in and around the goal last night. He is found wanting. What I like about him is, and more or less what I've just said about Matt Ritchie there, the majority of the time he puts his all into it. I mean, he was probably more effective and as effective in the opponent's box last night. He was always there. He's made one or two blocks. He's not the greatest player in the world, without a shadow of a doubt. But then he is just one of about, as we keep saying, half a dozen centre-backs who are pretty much of a muchness. It'll be interesting to see whether next game up they stick with the back four. I doubt it, but they may do. And when, you've got a back four, obviously it is obvious, you only need two centre-backs, and maybe then as one of two, they deem Shaw or Fernandez to be a better bet alongside Kieran Clark, or whether Kieran Clark drops out. But no, he isn't the best, and I can see where people get frustrated. He can be a bit of a show pony. He commits himself. He gets into situations he shouldn't get into. He's not the greatest on the ball, but we're just not blessed with alternatives. We're not blessed with alternatives. And as I say, the one thing that you can guarantee from him, you'll get 100%. And if you think about what Steve Bruce was as a centre-half, I can see why he appeals to Steve Bruce, because he wears his heart on his sleeve. But no, if you're a purist, you would look for an alternative, definitely.
Yeah. Mick, how do you rate Longstaff? Lost on occasions, but, says Roger. What's your views on Sean Longstaff? I mean, he had a bad injury. It's took him a while to bounce back from it, but he's getting a run in the team now by Bruce.
Yeah, he grew into the game last night, but as I say, that was basically down to the change of system. In the first 15, 20 minutes, him and Joe Willock may as well have not been on the field. I mean, they were just getting overrun. Leeds were just in control of midfield, and as a result, we couldn't get hold of the ball. Calvin Phillips is a very, very good player. I heard Gary Neville describe him beforehand as the best English midfielder in the Premier League, and it's impossible to argue with that. I mean, he does everything. But I'm telling you, once Joe Willock and Sean Longstaff got a bit of help from Isaac Hayden, Phillips disappeared from the game. Phillips wasn't anything like the influence on the game in the second half as he was in the first, when they had virtually the freedom of St James's Park for the first half hour. So they sort of grew into the game, him and Joe Willock. They're workers. The one thing I would say about Sean Longstaff is I just think every now and then he needs to calm himself down a little bit. There were a couple of these instances last night where he's shooting from about 150 yards. You know, I mean, you don't need to. Just play it simple. I think on occasions he maybe tries to impress too much or tries to catch the eye a little bit too much. He's a good, steady away midfield player, and that's all he needs to be. You know, you've got Isaac Hayden there tidying up. You don't necessarily need him to be the ball player, but as I've talked about on here before, as my ideal three in midfield for Newcastle, I would have Isaac Hayden as the protector and the ball winner, Shelvey as the ball player, and Willock hopefully as the man who makes late runs and scores goals. Now, you know, Sean Longstaff in that equation is the guy filling in for Shelvey, and I think that's when the decision will come, when John Joe Shelvey is fit again. And I have to say, for me, John Joe Shelvey would always get the pick ahead of Sean Longstaff. But I don't think, without any doubt at all, it's beyond Sean Longstaff to make that place his own if he becomes consistently better, because you know there isn't an awful lot between him and John Joe Shelvey. But I think he just needs to knuckle down, calm down a bit, and just concentrate on his game. I think again, maybe it's because he's a local lad and you try that a little bit harder. You want to impress. There's maybe a little bit more pressure on you as well. He knows that while Shelvey's out of the team, he maybe has to try that little bit harder to make sure John Joe Shelvey can't get back in. But either way, you know, there's a player in there. Whether there's a first team player for 5 years at Newcastle remains to be seen.
Yeah, are we missing Shelvey? Paul Oxley said we're missing Shelvey badly in midfield. People call him, but he's our best central midfielder that can actually pass a ball. Do you think we're missing that creativity from him?
Absolutely, no doubt about it. Because, you know, I've said that on here before. You know, whatever people think of him, he does something that no one else in that team does. He links the play and he can pass a ball. He's got a range of passing. You know, they highlighted Calvin Phillips last night before the game and his range of passing. John Joe Shelvey's the same. John Joe Shelvey will pick it up in exactly the same position the likes of Calvin Phillips will, and he'll look. And if it needs to go 40 on the diagonal, it'll go 40 on the diagonal, and it'll hit whoever it's intended for. You know, what he does sometimes is over elaborate John Joe Shelvey. But I mean, you know, there's a case in point. Are we missing John Joe Shelvey? You know, in the way that I've come on here in the past and said that Alan Saint-Maximin in some, you know, on occasions frustrates me, and he does frustrate me. In the same way that Alan Saint-Maximin, when he's good, he's absolutely bang on. He's brilliant, like he was last night. But when he's off, he's a little bit off. The counter to that is Miguel Almiron, who when he's good, and he was good at Old Trafford. But when he's bad, he's absolutely. I mean, last night, he must have given the ball away a dozen times, and in the end, he got hooked. And they had to hook him because he was having a terrible time of it. He runs around. He's one of these. He's like the Duracell bunny, isn't he? You know, he runs around, and you think, oh, you know, he is contributing into the game, and he tracks back. But the number of times he gives it away, and you just cannot give it away in the Premier League. If you give it away in the Premier League, before you know it, you'll be a goal down. You'll be 2 goals down. So it had to happen. So again, you know, when Shelvey's fit, maybe there's a case for going 4-4-2. Callum Wilson is the big question mark. I heard it rumoured last night that he might not be back until the next international break, which is middle of October. Now, that would be absolutely horrendous, because as good as Saint-Maximin was last night, we cannot rely on one man as much as they relied on him last night. And he won't be able to turn in those sorts of performances day in, day out, game in, game out. So they need Wilson back. They need Shelvey back. He needs options. And if they can sort the defence out and get themselves, you know, somewhere near stable, they might start winning a few games of football.
2 seconds, mate. Bruce has no pride and even less idea. The lad has sadly lost the whole realms of reality and relevance. He's stirring pans until another desperate club offers him an escape route. And question, but this is one from Ginger Hoskin. Question by Stephen Mick: as a team of players and manager, aren't they supposed to be backing each other and fighting together? Why is Bruce never with his players? We know he doesn't train them. What do you think of that?
Well, you know, we touched upon it briefly earlier, didn't we? When we talked about him going down the tunnel, I think I mentioned it on here the other week when prior to the Burnley penalty shootout in the League Cup, they went into a sort of huddle. Jones was involved, the coaches were involved, and Steve Bruce was stood to one side. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, maybe that's the way they're going. That maybe that's the way he wants to operate. I'm trying to think, Steve, off the top of my head. You tell me this as well. Do we ever think that Steve Bruce was a real sort of in with the boys, in with the huddle, arms round players, running on the pitch, patting people's backs? I'm not sure he's ever been that type of manager. I'm not sure he's ever been a real hands-on manager. He's always struck me as somebody who has been pretty much touchline based, hasn't really got overly emotional with it. I don't know whether that's just me imagining it, but I'm pretty sure that even in his previous clubs as well, he's not really been one of those for sort of hugging and kissing players and getting involved with them in that respect. And I don't think you necessarily have to do that. There are different types of managers for them to get their message across. What I would say is, to counter that, as I said before, there are occasions when he does look a little bit lost on that touchline, and there doesn't look to be an awful lot of communication. But, going back to the point about the team, again, did you think they were playing for him last night, Steve? Because I have to say, after 20 minutes, when the formation and the system was wrong, I thought this is going to be a hiding, and I'm not sure they're playing for him. Once they changed the system, once they became competitive, I thought they were playing for him. I didn't think there was anything wrong with their attitude last night, and I didn't think there was any question at all that they were playing for the shirt, they were playing for the team, but they were playing for their manager. So I don't believe that just yet. I have seen players down tools. I've seen players stop playing for managers, and they are not downing tools anytime.
I would agree with you. I would agree. I mean, obviously there was a big expose, another story from Craig Hope in the Daily Mail about training ground bust-ups. Look, we've been through this, and you have, when you were at Newcastle. Training ground bust-ups happen all the time, and if there's one that shows that people care, and ultimately it was with Dwight Gayle, who's not getting a look in anyway, but it does seem as if there is a bit of fight, and I've got to be honest. Whether it's under him, whether it's under Rafa, whether it was under Chris Hughton, when Newcastle have got backs against the walls, they're at their best, I think, Mick.
I agree 100%, because they've got people in there like Ritchie, because they've got people in there like the The one thing we haven't got, Steve, and again, this is brutally and blindingly obvious, we haven't got the quality that better teams have got. We've spent all our money on Joe Willock. I've said on here before, God bless him, he was the best thing. He almost single-handedly got us to 12th. He almost single-handedly kept us in the Premier League with all those goals at the end of last season. But they had to spend their entire kitty on Joe Willock, who isn't going to produce that sort of form again, unless he turns into a world beater. And as I've said before, I don't think he will. But he's a good kid. He's a good player. He's got a good attitude. But the purple patch that he had at the end of last season will be almost impossible to replicate. So the money that should have been spent on players just wasn't spent on players. And if you don't have the players, then you don't give yourself a chance of winning the game. Interestingly, you touched on him there, Chris Hughton. I text Chris Hughton in the week to say, sorry I didn't get the chance to see you at Forest because of COVID, blah-de-blah-de-blah. And he, as good as said in his reply, it was a tough time, but I just couldn't get the players in the summer who I need. Every manager I've ever dealt with at Newcastle United, and every manager who's ever managed a football club, Steve, will tell you this. A good team is based on good players. And you can have the greatest manager in the world, and if he doesn't have good players, he'll struggle. You can have the worst manager in the world, and if he has the best players, he won't struggle. It's down to players. It's down to the quality. It's down to the standard of player that you put out on that pitch. And sadly, you take out Alan Saint-Maximin, you take out Callum Wilson, we are struggling for genuine talent. And one of those isn't playing enough, and the other is a little bit inconsistent. So when it comes to fight, your Willocks, your Longstaffs, your Ritchies, your Kieran Clarks, your Jamal Lascelles, you can't have a problem with them. You can't have a problem with them. They're putting it into the best of their abilities. So, if If there's a finger to be pointed at the manager in terms of results, then that finger also has to be pointed by Steve Bruce at the powers that be to say, if you give me money, I'll buy better players. And if we buy better players, we'll have a better chance of winning the game. But that is so obvious and so much the problem that we're almost reluctant to say it again, because we say it every time.
Yeah, big shout out to the sponsors, Spider VPN, for all your internet security. Google Spider VPN, they come up at the top of the Google search list. They can help protect your computer from people trying to hack into it. Big thanks to skipsandbins.com, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com, website www.skipsandbins.com, easy contract free and pay-as-you-go waste collection. Also thanks to L&G Family Funeral Directors, 0191 389 7245, and to qtechshop.co.uk, the makers of pool tables and snooker tables in Wallsend, Newcastle, and obviously the people who run our website as well, NUFCmatters.com. Thanks to John at Jab Signature for making the flyers for the show. And if you're a first-time visitor to the channel, click the Newcastle Legends logo in the bottom right-hand corner, and that's it. You can subscribe for free. Hit the thumb up to like the video, click share to share to your social media, drop into the comments box to speak to like-minded Newcastle fans. We're also available on iTunes, Spotify, and all podcast providers. And as always, from our perspective, plenty of questions coming in. Jonathan Ward says, Stephen Mick, what was your opinion on Sky Sports allowing the fans to voice their opinion on the club? Do you think it was a box-ticking exercise or a genuine attempt to have the fans' voice heard? I thought they spoke well last night. Obviously, quite a few representatives there from NUST. Holly, who does the Monday night show with us, was on there as well. What did you make of that, Mick? It was nice to see at least the fans getting a chance to say something about the current predicament of our club.
Yeah, it's a nice idea, and it was nice for Jamie Carragher and Gary Neville to do it as well, because to that regard, they are showing due respect. They haven't just sent any old reporter along to Vox Pop, half a dozen guys who were associated with the football club. I meant to say at the top of the programme, actually, the best pre-match performance last night was by young Holly. Because I'm telling you, if you're confronted with Sky Sports cameras and you've got Jamie Carragher and Gary Neville, the two sort of mainstay interviewers, come pundits in English football these days, sitting 2 feet from you, she must have been having kittens. She was very, very good. Very good. The point she made about what fans expect and what fans don't expect, and what those outside of the area get wrong about that expectancy and those demands by Newcastle fans was absolutely right. So she did really, really well. But it was a nice idea. I sometimes think, as I said on here when we talked about the press conference at Old Trafford, I sometimes think they use it as a means to get other people to say what they want to say, or get other people who won't be libelled by the football club. I mean, what was interesting, you won't have seen the TV coverage, but late on in the game, Newcastle had a throw-in down in the corner, at the corner of the Leazes and the East Stand. And immediately this banner appeared, and it was clearly a banner. It was Mags against something, but the camera went off it in an instant. There was
Mags against Masters. Yeah.
Is that what it was? It disappeared so quickly off the screen. I couldn't work out whether that was Premier League or whatever it was. But Sky aren't going to allow their paymasters to be protested against. So in that respect, you say that Sky gave due deference to fans and what they wanted to say, but they let the fans say it rather than are seen to be implicit themselves. So there was never any chance that banners were going to be seen. There was never, there never has been. And to be fair, as you say, you don't go against your paymasters. But it was nice of them to do what they did. Alex Hurst, I know quite well. Thomas Concannon. I think the last time I saw Thomas Concannon, he was about 15. He'd sort of he'd grown into a full-blown man. I remember him back in the day on trains going away to games, and he was a bairn, So, but it was nice to see them. They put their point across, but they weren't really saying anything that we didn't know already. And as I say, I think Sky were using the guys to say, look, we haven't got a problem necessarily with X, Y, and Z, but it's the owner that's the problem. And to be fair, Gary Neville himself said after the game, this is a great club. You know, it might have been before the game or during the game, whenever. You know, this is a great club. It just needs to be sold. It needs a new owner. It needs a new injection. It needs somebody to invest in it. And again, the point was made, I think, when they were talking about the club being sold. Interestingly, I came on here, I think, last time or the time before and talked about him selling the club and said then, you know, he wants to sell it, reduce the price. And suddenly that was being talked about last night as well. So, you know, clearly everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet. You know, if you want to sell it, mate, reduce the price, get it sold, and we can all move on.
Yeah. I'll take Darren's second part of the question. What do you think Gayle's got to do to get a game?
I would. It sounds a bit callous, but improve. You know, Dwight Gayle will score goals at championship level all day, and you know, has been found wanting at Premier League level on many occasions. He is also he's quite a difficult character in my experience. In my experience of him, he's quite a difficult character to get through to relate to get the message across. It didn't surprise me in the same way. I don't like the stories. I'd love this snitch or this whatever you want to call him at the training ground who keeps giving stories to the Daily Mail. I'd love him to be exposed for what he is. But it didn't surprise me when hot on the heels of Matt Ritchie having a bust up, because Matt Ritchie's feisty. It didn't surprise me that the next character in the frame was Dwight Gayle, because Dwight Gale's difficulty. You know, he's a similarly feisty. He's not so much feisty. It's just tough to get to know, sort of thing.
Yeah.
But at the same time, and I know where everyone's coming from, because if there's one player who I am a critic of, as we all know, it's the big Brazilian, who again last night, you know, there was more chance of me scoring from 120 miles away than there was of him scoring. So, you know, yes, he did one or two things, but he's paid to score goals. He's paid £40 million to score goals. Then people start saying he's not a goal scorer. But 6 goals in 74 games? Believe me, you know, the majority of people have been binned by now. But I just don't think they can get rid of him in the current climate. But what I'm trying to say is that he has to be as good a bet as Dwight Gayle. I heard Steve as Joe Linton. I heard Steve Howie say in the week, quite rightly, that the one thing, even if Dwight Gayle doesn't particularly contribute, even if he's not really a Premiership standard player over 90 minutes week in, week out, if a chance falls to him, you'd rather have a chance fall to him than Joe Linton. And chances do fall to players, you know, and they need to react and they need to finish them. And your money would be on Dwight Gayle ahead of Joe Linton every time. But clearly, you know, Joe Linton brings a bit of height. He brings a bit of power. He disrupts defences. If nothing else, he's a distraction, which allows whoever's playing up there with him a little bit more time. I'm not sure Dwight Gayle brings that. So no, I mean, I just didn't understand. The greatest indictment, Steve, of course, and we've said this before, is if you're not going to play him, why give him a contract? You know, they wonder why there's no money for players, and they give a contract to somebody who sits on the bench and never even moves. I mean, what's Dwight Gayle pulling in? You know, 30, 40,000 £40,000 a week, £2 million a year.
The only thing I can think of, Mick, is that there must be some kind of clause in his contract which stipulates that if he plays X amount of games, he's going to get a pay rise. You know what I mean? They clearly give him a new contract, thinking they were going to be able to sell him. They couldn't sell him because he gets paid too much, and it wouldn't surprise us if he's going to get a pay rise if he plays X amount of games.
Well, if that's the case, he's got the greatest agent in the world. Whoever his agent is, he should be paid in bucketfuls of gold. Because if he's managed to wangle a deal like that for a player who, as I say, is very good at championship level, but has proven to be wanting time and time again at Premiership level, then fair play to him, fair play to his agent. But again, whoever's signed the deal, whoever's done the deal at Newcastle, if it was the same person who did the deal with Joe Linton, then as I've said before, they shouldn't be anywhere near the corridors of power at St James's Park.
Any thoughts on Willock? Billy's asking, do we think the minutes in Willock's legs have led to better performances?
Yeah.
I thought he was much better last night. I mean, he's not banging the goals in, but we're playing different, playing in a different style. We're missing our main striker. What's your thoughts on Willock so far?
I made the point in the summer, Steve, and I made the point when it was up for grabs whether he was going to sign or not. Do you know what it is they say in football, and it's true to just about anything in life? It's easy to win something; it's to retain it. So when Manchester United, ironically, with Steve Bruce, hadn't won the First Division title all those years, when they won it first season of the Premier League, it was one thing to win it, but everybody said, quite rightly, the test is to retain it. They ended up winning it 7 of the first 9 seasons. And retaining something is the hardest thing in the world, in any sport, in football in particular. And it's the same as an individual. When there's no expectancy on you, when you're trying to win something, when you're trying to prove yourself, then that's easy. It's then backing that up time and time again. And Joe Willock did brilliantly well to win himself a contract, to win himself a deal to Newcastle. He wanted to go to Newcastle. It was good for his career. It was probably good for him as a person to get away from London. He speaks brilliantly well. I listened to him on the BBC Newcastle phone. The kid's exceptional. But the level of pressure on that kid now, Steve, believe it or not, is up there somewhere now, because he's expected, and fans want the Joe Willock who scored all those goals at the tail end of last season and kept Newcastle in the Premier League. And as I keep saying, it's going to be almost impossible for him to replicate that form. Last night, he starts the game playing in centre midfield alongside, as we mentioned earlier, probably the best English midfielder in the country at the minute. Now, that's tough. That's tough. He's a young man finding his way. He has played very few Premier League games. Suddenly he's up against Calvin Phillips. He needs help. He needs to develop. They needed to put Isaac Hayden into midfield to sort of look after him along with Sean Longstaff. There's very definitely a player in there, Steve. As I say, to what level he gets to, I don't know. But at the minute, for me, there's absolutely no doubt the kid is trying his utmost to do what he did at the end of last season. And sometimes that's just not possible. And he knows everybody wants him to. And he knows everybody expects him to. And it must be the hardest thing in the world. If you've hit the heights, it's a bit like turning in an Oscar-winning performance in a film and then getting a bad script and trying to replicate it again. You can't do it. You can't do it. So your heart goes out to him to a degree. But as I say, he seems to be level-headed enough. He seems to be mature enough. He's clearly got ability, because you don't score the goals he scored at the end of last season if you haven't got the ability. It's just, I think, a little bit like Sean Longstaff when I said earlier. I think he just needs to breathe. I think the pressure that's coming down on Bruce, the pressure that's coming down on the team, the pressure that's coming down on the club, then manifests itself in individuals as well, and especially young players. And I think Joe Willock's feeling the pressure. I think the likes of Longstaff are feeling the pressure. Your Saint-Maximins of this world. Almiron looked last night like he was trying too hard. They're desperate to win games. They're desperate to win games for the fans. They're desperate to win games for the manager. And they're desperate to win games for themselves. And sometimes you can just try too hard. But he'll come again, Joe Willock. He's a player. Absolutely a player.
Jonathan Ward wants to know, without ASM in the team, do we have anyone you think that can genuinely step up and be a game changer winner? You're shaking your head, Mick.
Well, because, as I said earlier, without Callum Wilson, last night it was pretty close to a one-man show. I mean, he was brilliant, but you just spent the whole game saying, give it to ASM, give it to Saint-Maximin, because when he's hot, he's absolutely unplayable. You talk, you're going back to Neville and Carragher. These are top players, but they are waxing lyrical about him, and they weren't doing that out of any sycophantic and trying to talk up the game and trying to win favour and maybe give Steve Bruce a helping hand, because it was there for all to see. He got on the ball. We've all seen them, Steve, over the years. Players who get you on the edge of your seat, players who do something, and sometimes they do things that you think, well, just tackle him. Honestly, you can't. Sometimes they make it look that easy. He was absolutely out of this world, but he can be a little bit inconsistent. But going back to the question, he is our one shining light in that respect. Wilson is top quality, but Wilson does what Wilson does. Wilson puts the ball in the back of the net. Shelvey, for me, is our one creative midfielder who can pass a ball and pick a pass. But he's the one who can change a game. He's the one, if you give him the ball, there's every chance that something can come from nothing. Time and time again last night, he picks it up out wide. He takes players on. His pace is electric. His pass selection last night was better. Sometimes that lets him down. Sometimes he runs down cul-de-sacs. Sometimes he runs down bloody ring roads. But other times he gets it right. And he got it right last night. And when he gets it right, your big fear watching the game last night, Stephen, I'm sure I'm not alone in this, and I'm sure there were probably 30 of the 50,000 watching it thinking, we won't be able to keep hold of him. You know, next transfer window, if he keeps playing like that, Steve, I'm sorry, someone's going to come knocking. Absolutely.
100%.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. And I'm talking top teams as well. So
yeah, he'd fit into Man City. He'd fit into Man City, Liverpool, any of those teams.
He'd fit in anywhere. He'd fit in on his day. He'd fit in anywhere. And that's the double-edged sword. You want him to play well. You want him to win games. But all he's doing, believe me, is putting himself in the shop window, and he's getting bigger and bigger, and his reputation's getting better and better.
Yeah, Paul talking about the protests. He's saying Toon fans bottle protests because they don't want to lose season tickets. Totally get that. So let's block roads outside, get kick-off delayed when the next live game is on Sky. I mean, look, I'm not going to endorse anything which is going to, cause any problems for Newcastle United as a football club outside the ground, inside the ground. It's up for other people. They want to do stuff like that. And I totally get why people want to protest. Protest NUFC suggested last night that people take whistles into the ground and do paper aeroplanes. Probably about 25, 30 paper aeroplanes, I think, made it down onto the pitch. Look, I'm not going to criticise them, Mick. At least people are trying to do something.
Absolutely.
There was plenty of people blowing whistles in and around the ground, I think, last night. But Leeds United fans were so vociferous throughout. Gallagher were backwards and forwards with the Leeds fans. It all paled in insignificance, really. So, what do fans do? I mean, how can fans make a difference, Mick? It's a nightmare, isn't it, really, for us as a fan base?
Yeah, two phrases spring to mind immediately, Steve. Fall on deaf ears and banging your head against a brick wall. And I'm telling you, there is a massive, massive, massive understatement in both of those if you apply those statements to Mike Ashley. Fall on deaf ears, they don't even fall on ears because he's never at the game, he's never in the ground, he's never in the area, he's probably very rarely in the country. And as for banging your head against a brick wall, again, you could stand there for another 10 years and just keep banging, and it wouldn't make a blind bit of difference. I've been critical on occasions of Newcastle fans about how splintered they've been in terms of trying to get together, trying to have some sort of concerted protest. But increasingly, Steve, I'm beginning to wonder whether it would make the blindest bit of difference, because I don't think in some ways there's a conscientious or human bone in his body. I just don't think he cares in that slightest. I don't think, even if it got personal, and you wouldn't want it to get personal, and you certainly wouldn't advocate it getting personal, because that is wrong. And in the same way that I think fans are getting way too personal on occasions with Steve Bruce, I think that's wrong. You shouldn't get personal. If you want to protest against the regime or protest against the way the club is being run. If you want to protest against the manager, protest against the results, because he'll take that. Protest against the performances, he'll take that. But not personal, not when families are involved, and not even personally with Mike Ashley, who probably doesn't hear or see more than about 5% of it. So it is the $1 billion question. You're absolutely right, Steve. How do we try to force the issue? And the only thing you can think of is if somebody somewhere can find somebody with 250, 300 million and persuade them to buy Newcastle United, because other than that, I can't for the life of me think about it. And the protests last night, yes, they were a little bit token, but people have been anaesthetized, Steve. People have been anaesthetized. They don't feel it anymore because he's just run them into the ground. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that. Nothing will change. Nothing will change until there's a change of owner.
Thoughts on the referee? Mark Edward Brown says, any comments on last night's terrible referee performance, getting in the way of players, no booking for Leeds players, kicking the ball away, pulling the short of Joe Linton? He was shocking.
Do you know what it is? Do you know what I couldn't stop thinking of? And it just made me worse. It just made my blood boil even more. Remember the picture of him when he went to see Tranmere in some sort of playoffs, or because he's a Tranmere fan, Mike Dean, and he had his jeans and t-shirt on, and he's giving it that, and I'm thinking, all right, we want our officials to be human, and we want our officials to show that they're football fans and go to football games. Haven't got a problem with that, but that and the performance last night allied together. It was like me. One of these referees who's just not happy unless everyone's talking about him, unless he's the centre of attention, unless he's making decisions, unless he's got his arm round a player and he's laughing. There was one conversation he had with Luke Ayling, and I swear to God, it was like two blokes having a conversation down the pub. It was like, all right, mate, yeah, you had a bad tackle, that, wasn't it? Oh, no. Did you think so? Yeah, come on, let's get on with it. You know, and he was driving me mad. And then he kept making bad decisions. And when he got in the way of what was a perfectly good pass, no. I think again, one of the pundits said afterwards, the standard of refereeing has been very good at the start of this season. But last night, it's almost like he stopped refereeing the game and just went, look at me. Here I am, Friday night, St. James's Park, big crowd, Mike Dean. No, poor, absolutely poor.
Yeah, he was. Did you think the team looked a bit fitter last night, Mick?
I think it was a good. It's always a good yardstick. That probably the best yardstick, of course, in the Premier League, as to if you think there's a question mark against the fitness of your team, or if you think they're not being trained properly, or if you think one or two of them aren't putting it in. The team you want to play are Leeds United with Bielsa playing murder ball with them all week and running them up and down hills and running them 3,000 miles. Oh, they were talking last night about murder ball. It was Liam Cooper was saying it's our favourite time of the week, murder ball, because we play 4 5-minute murder balls. There's no such thing as fouls. Bielsa doesn't even ref it. He just lets them go at it for like these little 5-minute games. And he said they love it. They absolutely love it. So if you're gonna measure yourself physically against any team in the Premier League, do it against Leeds, because I mean there were a couple of breaks they had on last night. Dear me, 1 minute it's in the hands of the Leeds keeper, and there's 8 Newcastle players in the final third. The next minute they've got 5 on the edge of our box who are queuing up. It ends up with the left back putting one over the crossbar, a la Chris Waddle in Turin, from about 10 yards. But honestly, they were queuing up while we were trying to get back from our own half, from their own half. But no, I don't think fitness is a problem. What is a problem is the pace and the lack of it in our defence, and that sort of made the point there about every time they broke on us, Leeds United. We've got Lascelles and Clark at centre back, not the quickest in the world. We've got midfield players filling in at fullback, left hand side through Matt Ritchie. We've already talked about that pace, and right fullback. I talked about Manquillo last time, and he stayed with Manquillo, but Manquillo was in and out. Manquillo was lucky last night because I said beforehand I thought this would be a test, because young Daniel James, who they brought back from Manchester United for 25 million, I had visions of him ripping us apart last night, and he barely touched the ball. I don't think Manquillo had to make a challenge, and in the end he was hooked. I can only think that Daniel James isn't match fit because he's only just made the move from Manchester United where he wasn't getting a game. Yeah, but he was completely out of sorts. So you couldn't really judge the right fullback. But no, I don't think we're necessarily lacking fitness, but we are lacking pace in terms of a back four.
Where's the first win coming from, says Alan? It's got to be next week at Watford, Mick.
It's a good question, because funnily enough, when I was looking at the fixtures beforehand, you were thinking, all right, the first 4 or 5 aren't bad. But what I was saying was, and I think this is to answer your question, the Watford and Wolves away games will almost wholly depend. It sounds stupid. It sounds obvious. Will depend on the results in the first 5 games. Now, the fact that we haven't won in the first 5 suddenly makes Watford nervy, suddenly makes Watford edgy, suddenly makes Watford all not must win, but getting closer to it. And Watford are a strange beast, you know. Watford can be as exciting on the day as they can be awful on the day. Watford can be as good as they can be poor. You know, I'm told that Musa Sissoko, who has gone there, was brilliant last time out. So, you know, what price a former Newcastle player again coming back to haunt them. But, you know, I think the bottom line is, Steve, when you say things like, surely got to win at Watford, I'm afraid those 3 or 4 words, surely got to win, went out of Newcastle's vocabulary about 4 years ago. You know, there isn't any such thing as a game that you know. Once upon a time, Leeds at St James's Park would have been, you know, you put it down as a W. You put Southampton at home down as a W. West Ham once upon a time would definitely have been a W at St James's Park. You can't put a W against any fixture these days, you know. And we're not the only ones, you know. We're not the only ones, but at this minute in time, we're very definitely one of the ones in that bottom 3 who you couldn't say with any certainty whatsoever whether they'll win or not. You know, it's funny because the run is now, what is it, 7 Premier League wins in 34 for Steve Bruce. Ironically, going back to a 5-2 defeat by Leeds last year. So he's won 7 of 34. And when you consider 5 of those were in the last 8 of last season, you know, the stats are beginning to mount up. And I had a quick look in the week because it suddenly started playing on my mind. What was Bobby's record when he got the sack? He got the sack at the end of August. So he got the sack not far away from where we are now. He had won 2 of 13 and had won only 1 of 5 at the start of a season. And there was that talk that he lost the dressing room. But he'd finished 5th the previous season. And going back to the word we used earlier, expectation, there's one thing to talk about the expectation of fans and get it wrong. And there's one thing to talk about the expectation of supporters and what supporters believe to be, you know, how Newcastle should play, how Newcastle should get results. But it's the expectation of the owner, which is more important. And the expectation of Sir John and Freddie Shepherd back in the day was that we should always be a contender. We should always be somebody who finishes top 6 or should qualify for Europe or certainly finish top half. And as a result, good managers got the sack because they weren't doing that. The expectation levels now with this owner are so low, as we all know, it's all 17th and upwards, and that's fine. 17th, survive, it's fine. So we shouldn't be surprised that, you know, when I'm thinking, God almighty, if Bobby Robson had the record that Steve Bruce has got, there's no way he'd be in a job, you know. But actually, it's a different regime, it's a different time. So, you know, Steve Bruce is going to hang on to a job for the foreseeable future, I'm sure, because the owner has no interest in getting rid of him and feels he has no need to get rid of him.
Great stuff as always, Mick. I'm going to Watford next Saturday for my sins. So
good lad.
If you're up for it next Sunday, mate, have a look back at that game.
Yeah, definitely. Can I just say a couple of other things? Just one
thing. Go for
actually. It. I don't know whether anyone's seen it online or seen it in the news because I'm down here in the Midlands. Our great mate, and we talked before about players who wore their heart on their sleeve and players who played for the club and played for the shirt. James Perch, good old Perchinio, suffered a fractured skull in training in the week. And he's at Mansfield now. Funnily enough, I was due to go through to see him a couple of weeks ago when they played Harrogate and couldn't get through. And he said, "I'll sort you out," and etc., etc. And I sent him a text, and I said, all black and whites will be pulling for you. I think he's okay. He texts that he thanks the medical staff at Mansfield and he wishes the lads well for the rest of the season. But he obviously won't play again. But he suffered a fractured skull. So if anybody feels the need to give Perchy or something, some sort of support online, just to say get well soon, mate, or whatever. He was a good servant to Newcastle. He was going back to the Matt Ritchies of this world. He always put it in Perchinio, and obviously got the nickname Perchinio from those on Tyneside. So get well soon, James Perch. And
get well soon.
We'll talk after Watford.
Great stuff, Mick. Have a good week, mate. Take care, pal.
Easy. See you later.
Head back with the critics of time.